I just finished watching the new Netflix documentary, A Toxic Love Story, and I have two takeaways. One, we need to talk more about triangulation and why it's so dangerous. And two, why is it that behind so many narcissistic men is a pick-me girl? Welcome to Character Analysis, the channel where I break down human behavior in dating, internet culture, and dark psychology to help women spot patterns before they become problems. I don't plan on talking about the documentary itself. However, I will give a spoiler warning because I might mention some of the plot points from the documentary. Let's first talk about what triangulation is. Triangulation is a tool used by somebody who's trying to manipulate another person. And what they do is introduce a third person or a third entity into the dynamic between themselves and the other person, and then weaponize that third person to get what they want. I recently wrote a post on my Substack about my experience with narcissistic abuse and triangulation. I'm going to link to it in the episode description. The reason why triangulation is usually so successful is because it's often mistaken for jealousy. Because from the outside, it just looks like two people are competing for the other person, whether it's the other person's attention, validation, love. And I make that clarification because triangulation is used in many different dynamics and in many different types of relationships. Now, in this documentary, a man named Ian Diaz, who's a U.S. Marshal, he convinced his wife to take part in a plot to put his former girlfriend, Michelle Hadley, in prison. And it almost worked. Because not only did he have Angela under his thumb, but he also had a friend named Leslie. And Leslie is the pick-me girl in question. She's interviewed throughout the documentary, and she insists that she's just friends with Ian, that she's not in love with him. And even though all kinds of evidence comes to light about this plot that he hatched with his wife, Angela, to put Michelle in prison, she still maintains his innocence. And I think she was actually included in this documentary not just to sort of advocate for Ian, but to demonstrate just how persuasive some people can be when they play the victim. To the point where they're able to convince relatively intelligent people to believe their lies. Another reason why triangulation often gets swept under the rug is because many times it involves two women fighting over a man. Maybe it's a romantic partner, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a boss. The prize in that scenario is very often a man. And so triangulation is usually just perceived as a catfight. But it's not. It's a tool used to control and manipulate somebody. And it's also used to isolate them. Because triangulation can be used to convince somebody that they don't have anybody on their side, that nobody likes them, that their friends don't really have their backs. And like a lot of signs of abuse, it starts off really small. They don't try to convince you of anything, they just plant seeds. The person doing the triangulating will say something really simple like, "Why does it seem like your friend is competing with you?" And they'll continue to chip away at that relationship. And when they want that extra little push to convince you to ditch a friend or convince you that they're right and you're wrong, they'll trot out the pick-me girl. A pick-me girl is just another way to say she's a male-centered woman, meaning she prioritizes male attention and male validation. Now, in the documentary, Ian had Leslie. And when Ian finally filed a restraining order against Michelle, it was Leslie who delivered it. Because that's what men like Ian do. They use pick-me girls to do their dirty work. But it was also a way to set up conflict between Michelle and Leslie. Now, in order for triangulation to work, the person doing the triangulating needs to ensure that the people involved in the dynamic, that they don't compare notes. That's the worst thing for somebody who's trying to triangulate. So if you ever sense that somebody is trying to pit you against another person, before you get angry, have a conversation with them and compare notes and see what you've been told about them and what they've been told about you. Now, if you watch the documentary, you'll learn that Angela, Ian's wife, she's got some issues. But I have no doubt that Ian was able to rope Angela into his scheme by positioning Michelle as some kind of threat to their relationship. And I'll also put money on the fact that when Ian turned Angela into the police, he did it as a way to discredit her, so that if she ever ratted him out, nobody would believe her, which is kind of what happened. Michelle was painted as the crazy ex-girlfriend, when really she was the one who knew how abusive Ian actually was. And of course, nobody believed her at first. Now, this story did finally work out in Michelle's favor, and she was exonerated. And Ian and Angela went to prison. But he was able to get away with that scheme for a very long time. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was able to keep all these women at odds so that they never talked and they never compared notes. And one of the other benefits is that if all of these women are focused on each other, they're not focused on him. And that allowed him and his behavior to slip under the radar, which is what happened when Michelle first got arrested. They had all kinds of proof that Ian was involved with this scheme, but they didn't do anything. And that's because he had Angela, who was so willing to be the face of this scheme. And people like Ian used people like Angela and Leslie to provide credibility to their stories. Ian was running around telling everybody how crazy Michelle was after they broke up, when really she ran away from him because he was abusing her. And he fell back on Leslie and Angela as social proof. He used them as evangelists to tell his story and put it out there so that people were more likely to believe him. They were the ones who, if anybody ever brought up things that Michelle said about Ian, would probably say, well, he's never done that to me. Or, I've never heard of him doing that. And that's how people like Ian use pick-me's to triangulate. Guys like Ian always make these sort of veiled promises, whether they're spoken or unspoken, to these pick-me girls. And as long as they're promised access to male validation, pick-me girls are willing to participate in schemes like this, which means they're easier to weaponize. You can watch A Toxic Love Story on Netflix. From what I understand, this documentary left out a few key details. I was told that the Dateline episode about this case was much better, and it's titled Diabolical. Follow me on TikTok at Character Analysis Pod and my character analysis for true crime content. And make sure you're following my Substack at characteranalysispod.substack.com. Subscribe to my Substack and get invited to my private Discord where we do voice calls and live stream events. You'll get access to the private group chat, as well as receive bonus podcast episodes and posts. That's characteranalysispod.substack.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you guys soon.